I never thought I'd be in a situation where my own husband would accuse me of cheating. With a horse. It sounds crazy, right? But things had started feeling off between us, and my connection with our horse somehow became deeper than I ever expected. I didn't see this situation coming, and I never imagined it would go as far as it did. Okay, let's rewind a bit. I'll start by saying my husband and I have been together for a few years. We're happy. At least we were. But somewhere along the line, things began to change. He got busier with work, and I spent more time alone on our farm. We'd bought a horse, Apollo, a beautiful black stallion with a spirit that was impossible to ignore. It was actually my husband's idea to get him. He thought the horse could keep me company on long, lonely days while he worked late. At first, it was just a casual thing. I'd go out to the stable, give Apollo some treats, brush him down, and maybe go for a quick ride around the property. But something shifted, and I found myself drawn to him in a way that was more than just companionship. Apollo seemed to understand me, even when I wasn't saying a word. And with my husband distracted, Apollo became the one who filled that empty space. As time went on, I'd wake up thinking about him. I couldn't wait to get out to the stable and spend time with him. I know how this sounds, but Apollo wasn't just a horse anymore. He was someone who listened, who was always there, and who understood me in ways I didn't even expect. I started to feel lighter around him, happier, almost as if he was the one thing keeping me going. My husband noticed the change, though he couldn't put his finger on what was happening. He'd comment on how much time I spent with Apollo, but I brushed it off, saying it was just part of taking care of him. But then, one evening, things took a turn I didn't see coming. My husband came home early, something he almost never did, and walked into the barn just as I was whispering something to Apollo. I didn't even hear him come in. I was too caught up in the moment. And when I turned around, his expression said it all. He didn't say much then, but I could see it in his eyes. A mix of confusion, jealousy, and maybe even a little anger. I felt embarrassed, caught like a deer in headlights. He asked me, half joking, but with a bit of edge, "Is there something going on here I should know about?" It felt ridiculous, and yet I couldn't deny that his words stung. We laughed it off, but I could feel the tension in the air, something unspoken hanging between us. He left the barn that night, but the suspicion was still there, lingering. And it wasn't just on his end. It was like his words had opened a door, making me question what I was feeling too. After that night in the barn, things felt different. My husband didn't bring it up again, but his eyes would follow me when I'd slip outside to be with Apollo. I tried to shake off the awkwardness, telling myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I couldn't deny the intensity I felt whenever I was around Apollo. It wasn't something I could explain or even fully understand. It was just there. Days turned into weeks, and instead of pulling back, I found myself spending even more time with Apollo. I knew my husband had questions, but he seemed too unsure, maybe even a little scared to ask. I'd catch him watching from the house while I was brushing Apollo, or see his car parked in the driveway a little longer, like he was hesitating to come inside. And whenever I'd get back to the house, he'd be unusually quiet, almost like he was piecing something together in his mind. One night, I sat down to dinner with him, and the silence was overwhelming. I could feel his eyes on me, like he wanted to ask something, but he kept stopping himself. Finally, he put his fork down and looked at me, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "Of course I am," I replied quickly, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. Was I really happy? Or was I just escaping into something that felt like happiness when I was with Apollo? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words, wondering what he was seeing that I wasn't willing to admit. My husband had always been supportive, understanding. So why did I feel like I was betraying him just by being close to Apollo? My mind was spinning with questions, and unable to find peace, I slipped out of bed in the middle of the night and made my way to the barn. The night was silent, the stars above casting a faint glow as I stepped inside. Apollo lifted his head when he saw me, his eyes bright and aware, as if he knew exactly why I was there. I felt a strange calm wash over me just being in his presence. I walked over, reaching out to touch him, my hand running down his mane. And in that quiet moment, it was as if everything else faded away. The confusion, the questions, the guilt. It was just me and him. But then, as I stood there in the barn, feeling closer to Apollo than ever, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, heart pounding, and there was my husband, standing in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. He didn't say a word, just stared, and I knew there was no way to explain what he was seeing. It was like he had caught me in the middle of something I couldn't even justify to myself. My heart raced as he finally broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, disappointment, maybe even anger. There I was, caught in that dim barn light with my husband standing right in front of me, looking like he was piecing together something far worse than I had ever intended. His words hung in the air. "We need to talk." I could tell he'd been waiting to confront me, that he'd been holding back for longer than I realized. My mind raced, trying to find the words to explain. But explain what exactly? Even I wasn't sure what I was feeling. We both stood there in silence, and then he turned and walked out of the barn. I could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he went back to the house. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the end of something, though I didn't know what. Part of me wanted to stay in the barn, in that safe space with Apollo, but I knew I couldn't avoid this. I took a deep breath and followed him back inside. When I entered the living room, he was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He didn't look up right away, and I could feel the weight of whatever he was thinking pressing down on both of us. Finally, he raised his head and looked at me, and there was this sadness in his eyes that hit me like a punch to the chest. "I don't know what's going on with you," he said, his voice shaking. "But whatever it is, it feels like I'm losing you. To him." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How was I supposed to explain what was happening when I didn't even understand it myself? All I knew was that I felt closer to Apollo than anyone else in my life. And saying that out loud felt wrong, as if I was betraying my husband, but also myself. I tried to find the words, but my husband kept going, each sentence more painful than the last. "I thought bringing Apollo into our lives would bring us closer, give you some company," he said, his voice barely holding together. "But it feels like he's taken you away from me instead. I'm not sure what I did wrong." Hearing him say that nearly broke me. He had no idea how lonely I'd felt, how his long hours and late nights had left me seeking comfort in the one place I felt truly seen. But as much as I wanted to pour out everything I was feeling, I was still struggling with my own guilt and confusion. Was it really Apollo? Or was there something else going on that I just didn't want to face? Just as I was about to say something, the silence stretched so thick I could feel it pressing down on me. Then, he finally asked, "Do you have feelings for him?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit like thunder. I couldn't answer. How could I explain a feeling I barely understood myself? All I could do was look down, avoiding his gaze as I felt the weight of my own uncertainty crushing down on me. The silence in the room grew colder, heavier, and I knew I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Not that night. Without a word, I turned and walked out, leaving my husband sitting alone in the living room, and made my way back to the barn. And there, as I stood beside Apollo, I found myself asking the very same question. Do I really have feelings for him? I stood there in the quiet of the barn, my heart pounding as I tried to process everything that had just happened. My husband's question, "Do you have feelings for him?" echoed in my mind, forcing me to confront emotions I'd been avoiding. But what did it even mean to feel close to a horse in that way? It sounded absurd, even to me. Yet I couldn't deny the sense of connection I felt whenever I was near Apollo. As I brushed his mane, I felt a kind of peace that I struggled to find anywhere else. But was that peace worth the cost of my marriage? I leaned against Apollo, trying to gather my thoughts, wondering if my husband could ever understand. The next morning, I found my husband waiting for me at the kitchen table. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, his eyes tired and his shoulders slumped. I knew this wasn't something that could be brushed aside anymore. We needed to talk, and we both knew it. "I can't keep doing this," he said, breaking the silence. "I feel like I've lost my wife to a horse, and it's tearing me apart." His words hit hard. I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right response. It's not like that," I said quietly. "I don't even understand what I'm feeling. I just know that being around Apollo gives me a sense of calm, of comfort. And with how distant things have been between us, it's just easier." He looked down, his jaw clenched, absorbing everything I'd said. "If it's comfort you need," he whispered, "why couldn't you come to me?" That question hit a nerve. Deep down, I knew he was right. I should have talked to him. Should have told him how I was feeling instead of hiding in the barn, searching for a connection I was afraid to seek in my own marriage. I reached out, taking his hand. And this time, I was the one to look him in the eyes. I think I've been avoiding how lonely I've been feeling, and instead of facing it with you, I took the easy way out. I'm sorry for that. Truly. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, but then he sighed, his expression softening. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "If Apollo is a part of your life, then fine. But you're my wife. I need to feel like I'm part of that life too." In that moment, I realized how much I'd taken him for granted, allowing my own insecurities to create distance instead of seeking understanding. Apollo had become a symbol of the peace I was missing, but it was my husband I truly needed by my side. Over the next few weeks, we worked to rebuild that bond, making time for each other in ways we hadn't before. I still spent time with Apollo, but now it was different. I no longer felt like he was filling a void. My husband and I were closer, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly happy in our marriage. And while Apollo would always have a special place in my heart, I knew where I truly belonged. Sometimes the connection we need is right in front of us, waiting to be rediscovered. Thank you for watching, and if you've ever found yourself in a moment of doubt, remember, communication can be the bridge back to those we care about most.